So I'm going to do something today that I don't typically do. I'm going to preach a part 2 kind of sermon. And what that means is it's a follow-up to what I shared last Sunday. And don't worry if you weren't here last week. I'm going to share enough about what I said in last week's sermon so that if you're listening, we'll all be on the same page. And let me just say that I'm going to preach about a topic that seems a bit foreign. You might even call it a bit exotic or far-fetched. Some of you even said to me, I'm not sure about this topic today, how it pertains to my life. I'm going to talk about mysticism and how it has everything to do with our lives as people of faith. And so my sermon topic today is called The Mystical Life. Last week I quoted Henri Nouwen, who I believe was also a mystic. And he talked about, he died in 1996, so he was preaching this message mightily over and over, right at the turn of the 21st century. And he talked about moving from the moral to the mystical life. He writes or preached, we must move from the moral to the mystical life. The great call for the church is not to be just concerned with right or wrong behavior, which is a moral life. He said the greater call is all about our communion with God, which is the mystical life. You see, what happens to us in the church and in our families is in politics, we get so focused on the issues. You know, morality is important, but our morality is to emerge, it's to flow out of our mystical lives, our communion, our deep, ever-abiding and infinite and intimate communion with God. You see, we take the morals first, and then we think, okay, and then I'll get my heart right, heart, mind, and soul. But now when it's saying the formula is just the opposite. Out of our relationship with God and others, we let our morality flow. But when we get caught up in the issues, whether that be in the church or in the world or in our families, it tends to separate us and divide us up, fragmenting our lives. And then Henri Nouwen quoted, I mentioned this quote last week, he quoted one of his mentors, Jean Vanier, a little backstory on him. He was French, and he started the L'Arche communities that are all over the world. And these are communities that Henri Nouwen lived in, and one in Canada. And these are communities with adults that have severe mental handicaps or intellectual struggles. And it's a place of Christian solidarity or spiritual solidarity for these people. And Jean Vanier started it. I found out a few years ago that Jean Vanier wasn't perfect. He had his moral issues, but he was a mentor and he had much to say about the mystical life. And he said this, we can only deal well with issues out of an infinite, and I would add intimate, relationship with God and others. Today we're looking at another post-resurrection story. We are still in the season of Easter. This is why I'm wearing a white parament or stole, and we have white on the altar. Easter is way too important. It's what defines us as followers of Jesus, the resurrection. So it's way too important to be one day only. And so Easter begins on Easter Sunday, and it ends at Pentecost, the great 50 days. And we're still in the Easter Sunday season. And so I've been preaching. Mark's helped me out a couple of weeks. Thank you. And we've been preaching these post-resurrection stories. And what that means is when Jesus, already crucified, already been risen from the dead, appears to people. And this is one of those stories. It's at the end of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 28. And Jesus is appearing to his disciples, and he goes up on this mountain, and he gives them this commission. We call it the Great Commission. He gives them, these disciples, those followers, in a little while he's going to be ascended into heaven. And so while he's in heaven, we are to be the hands and feet, right, of Jesus. And so this is what Jesus commands, the Great Commission. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, which just means everybody, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Now, I struggle with this phrase, make disciples. And I know some of you struggle with it because you've talked to me about it, and we go back and forth. Make disciples of Jesus Christ. It's the mission of our church. And I struggle with that phrase, make disciples, because over the years, what I've learned as a pastor is that you cannot force love. You cannot make someone follow Jesus. You cannot force someone to trust God and God's love. We as United Methodist, we believe that love is free. For God's love to be truly of God, it has to be freely given, freely received. And so we believe in something called free will. If you don't know this, you should. And what that means is that you can't put a gun to our heads and make us follow Jesus. We have to choose to trust God and God's love with our lives. So then how in the world, church, are we going to make disciples if you can't do it by force? What is making disciples? What is it? I think you have to look at the entirety of the gospel and look how Jesus makes disciples. And if you pay attention to what Jesus does, it's all about relationships. You know? Jesus spends time. He hangs out with. He's friends. Friendship should be a sacred word. I think it is. He's just friends with his disciples and other people. He parties. He hangs out. And he even is patient with those who betray him. He doesn't force it. Remember the rich young ruler? He's not bad. He's just not willing to put everything aside and follow. We have to choose this. So discipleship is all about how we cultivate our relationships. Relationships that are grounded, they're rooted in love. And I love how Paul describes love. Love is patient, it is kind, it is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on what? Its own way. Richard Rohr talks about cultivating relationships in the body of Christ, and he's like, you have to let go. Hear this, church. You have to let go. If we're going to make disciples through relationships, we have to let go of three things. The compulsion to be successful. The compulsion to be right. And hear this, church. And the compulsion to be powerful, which really means having everything under control. We have to let go of these things if we are to make disciples through our relationships. My sermon thesis for the day is from Henri Nouwen, and he says, mysticism is for all, not just for a few special people. And he says, based on our baptisms, we are called, all of us, to a mystical life, a deep and ever-abiding, infinite and intimate communion with God. And we need to claim that, to taste and feel it, and to trust that the deeper we live, hear this, church, the deeper we live in this communion, the more our behavior will witness to the truth. So if we're all called to the mystical life, what is it? You know, what is mysticism? Well, it's hard to put words around it. But I would compare it to when you first fell in love with someone, or when you held or have held a newborn baby, or when you first saw the ocean. Speaking of ocean, there's this story. This is an image from Thomas Keating, and he says there was this ocean, and there were some baby fish swimming all in it. And they were in it, you know, in the ocean, and they were curious about this thing called water, so they went to their mother fish, and they said, "Mother, teach us, what is water?" Now they're in it. They're swimming in it. That's just where they are. But this mother is an overachiever, and she wants to be a good mother, and so she decides to tell them all about it, what water is. And she's really a go-getter. So in her lesson, she puts together a PowerPoint, you know. And up goes the screen, and on goes the projector, and the computer gets hooked up, and that first slide reads the chemical formula H2O. That spells it out for them. And then the next slide is a waterfall, and she calls it Niagara Falls. And then the next slide is the huge Mississippi River, and talks about this being water. And then the next slide is a kitchen faucet, and out of the faucet, she says, flows what? Water. Now, at some point, it's good to know about it and learn about it, but at some point you need to take the projector, turn it off, put down the technology and the presentation and just experience it. This is the mystical life. It's beyond anything we can think or feel or even imagine. Here's a good illustration for you. I know some of you will resonate with it. It's like drinking wine, you know? Anybody here enjoy a glass of wine? I know you do. You're not going to get the effects of the wine. You're not going to get inebriated just talking about the wine or reading about the wine. You have to partake of it and taste it and receive it to get its effects, the mystical life. So there's this British nun, Carmelite. Her name is Ruth Barrows. That's her pen name. She goes by Rachel, I think. She doesn't want to be famous, but she's written so much about the mystical life. And here's how she defines mysticism. It's going to be on the screen, I believe. Mysticism is being touched by God in a way that is deeper than language, thought, imagination, and feeling. It's knowing God and ourselves beyond explicit thought and feeling. That's a lot to chew on, so maybe we'll post that a little bit later on Facebook. Now, Ron Rolheiser talks about three sinners. I call them the interior trinity. But we humans have three sinners: the mind, my favorite, the heart, and then there's the gut. And with the head, we think and we imagine things. With the heart, we feel and experience emotions, and they can be opposing. Like you can have, love and compassion, but you can also feel fear and, let's say, resentment. Now, sometimes we, according to Ron Rolheiser, we confuse the heart with the gut, And he says that the gut refers to our ought center, O-U-G-H-T. It's where we sense those things that we have to do. Can't explain it, but we just got a gut feeling. We've got to do it. This is our action center, he says. Now, have you ever been in a situation where your heart's not in it? Your head's not either. It makes no logical sense, but you did it anyway. You just had to. That's what we're talking about. This is a rhetorical question, so do not answer, okay? But how many of you are here in church today? Your head's not really in it. Your heart's not really in it. But your backside's here. There's something about it. You had to be here. Maybe it didn't make you feel good. And maybe it made no logical sense, but you had to be here. And Ron Rolheiser says this is the mystical life. So it does pertain to you, after all. Think about Jesus in that Garden of Gethsemane. I don't think he wanted to go to that cross. His prayer shows that. Take this will from me, but on the other hand, your will be done. What gave Jesus the power to endure the cross? It was the mystical life. I bet his heart was breaking. We know he was in such anguish that his sweat became like drops of blood. And then he had to think, this is ridiculous. Why would I go through this? It makes no logical sense. Was it his gut or all three that gave him the ability to follow through with the cross? It was the mystical life, this deep, ever-abiding, infinite, and intimate communion with God. Now, maybe you're thinking, I've touched on this already, but let me touch on it again. You're still thinking all this mystical language, and I'm not, I'm no Jesus, Remember, Jesus doesn't hoard what he experiences. He always shares. Jesus wants what he wants for himself. He wants for you and for me. And sometimes we think, well, this is just for, the spiritually elite. But Ruth Barrows says the mystical life is not reserved for a privileged few. It's for everyone. And so, another slide here. I want you to hear this. The destiny of every Christian is to be a mystic. if you're baptized, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you want to be baptized, the destiny of every Christian is to be a mystic, deep, ever-abiding, intimate, and infinite communion with God. And some of us think, well, this is so impossible. I'm going to put it off to when I die and go to heaven, you know? Or some say, you know what? I am too busy. I've been asking you to take this emotionally healthy spirituality class, and 80 of you have, and we've got several of you signed up, but the answer, the most common answer I'm given for this 8-week course, what gets you in rhythm of those mystical practices, the biggest answer I'm given is, I'm just too, what? Busy. We're so busy we don't have time to commune with God. And it was Mother Teresa who said, when you are at your busiest is when you most need to pray. You know, I went to seminary. I was thinking about this. I went to seminary. I answered a call into the ministry because I wanted to be a mystic. More than anything. Since I was a little girl, I just wanted to be in complete communion with God and others with all my heart, soul, and mind. And then I went to seminary and I started taking these challenging courses and I started thinking about these moral and ethical issues. And then I started church and I got busy and I got distracted and I got worried and chop, 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 chop. My life became so fragmented. And I have a word for you. I didn't create it, but here goes. You're not going to find it in the dictionary, I don't think. Here's what we've done in the church. We have churchified the gospel. You know? We have churchified it. We've gotten so focused on the issues, like church laws and doctrines. Just try reading the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church. I call it the hairball of the denomination. It just sucks the spirit out, you know? Don't tell our bishop. Hopefully he's not watching. But we've gotten so focused on church laws and doctrine and these moral issues and the style of worship. Should it be contemporary or should it be more traditional? And we've let these issues separate us. Just think about what's going on in our own denomination, the United Methodist Church. You know, all these things that we care so much about, they are important, but they are containers. Even the Bible, which has been used to bring a lot of life to people, but a whole lot of harm too. The Bible, we don't worship the Bible. The Bible points us to God. It is God that we trust and worship and adore. You know, another reason I think we're reluctant to embrace the mystical life, to go around saying, hey, I'm a mystic, is because it requires of us an entirely new vision. We have to look through the lens of something radically different than what the world does. It requires new vision. Going back to the resurrection, we think of the resurrection as this big earthquake and everything was wild and, you know, Jesus came in like a superhero and set the world straight, but that's not how it went. Most people did not recognize at first the risen Lord. Just a few women and a few men. And the reason they were able to recognize the risen Christ is because the way they looked, the way they saw, the way they heard. They were able to do this through a lens of love and not fear. The key to recognizing resurrection is looking through the lens not of fear, but of love. You know, the opposite of love is not hate. It is fear. And the Bible says over and over, do not be afraid. If we want to understand the resurrection, we will shift from morality to the mystical. It's from our mystical lives that morals should emerge. And here's the challenge for us as a church, the Great Commission. If we don't make this shift, if we don't lead our lives, our families, our churches, our work, whatever we're up to, if we don't lead it out of mysticism, then here's what's going to happen. People aren't going to come to church. They're not going to want to hang out with us. Nobody likes to hang out with a moral know-it-all. Do you? People aren't going to want to hang out. They're going to sleep in and scroll on their iPads, or they're going to go play Mark a round or two of golf, or they're going to go and hang out and boat around the islands, or go check out our casinos. You know why? People aren't looking for knowledge. They have Google for that. What people are looking for is an experience. People want to experience the risen Christ. And our greatest sermon, the most persuasive sermon we can preach, is how we treat one another. Our relationships, which means we're going to have to let go of the compulsion to be successful, the compulsion to be, what was that second one? What? Oh, yeah, to be right. And then the hardest one of all for me, we're going to have to let go of that compulsion to be in control, or at least think we are in control. So if we make disciples, we're not going to be able to shove it down their throats. We're not going to be able to force them. It's going to happen in how we relate to God and one another with our heart, mind, and gut. I want to close with an article, just a paragraph. Ron Rolheiser, who I think is a mystic, he was asked in one of his articles, he writes about it, what kinds of things might induce mystical experiences in our lives? And here's what he says. Anything that takes you beyond your ego, your wounds, your affections, and the powerful social pressures within which you breathe. That is, anything that helps put you in touch with who you really are and makes you a better person. This can be many things, he writes. It might be a book you read. It might be the beauty of nature. It might be the sight of a newborn baby, a crying child, a wounded animal, or the face of someone suffering. Or it might be what you feel deep down when you receive an expression of love, when you bless someone, when you express genuine contrition, or share helplessness. He writes, it can be so many things. For me, the mystical life is in this community. I'll confess to you, almost 8 years ago now, I came down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and I had this idea that I was going to convert you. Hotty toddy. Here's what happened instead, and it's an Easter miracle. You have converted me in this deep and ever-abiding and infinite and intimate communion. So be it, and so it is.